Hello and welcome to episode 67 of The Garden Log with me, Ben Dark. I am a gardener and this is a gardening podcast. I am broadcasting to you from the period where mid-September shades into late September. A romantic time, and this year a slightly frazzled and sun-baked time. Though as I speak, that long late summer blast has just broken, and I have retrieved a paperback from the garden, sodden next to the chair, where just a day before people had been lounging and reading and basking in the glory of the skies. Now we are a hunched and huddled people, hiding from the rain and recording podcasts. This week in the podcast, I am talking about epimediums, and I'm talking about pansies. I'm also talking about planting up a majestic stone planter, shipped here at great expense to client and climate from the sunny hills of Italy. And talking about a visit to the archives within the Natural History Museum, and recommending a few books on matters horticultural and countryside, books to get you through the coming autumn, books to keep the mind active and alive, even when starved of vitamin D. It was a very exciting week for me, and I hope that comes across. You may judge for yourself as we listen to The Week in Gardening. Hello and welcome to The Week in Gardening, a dry and rustling week in the middle of September, one of those glorious bonus weeks of summer, but one that came after a long and very dry period, so it almost felt cruel. It felt like a joke that has gone on a little bit too long. It was fun at first, and we were all sharing in it and all delighting at the way it made us feel. And then it slowly began to dawn on the more empathetic members of our cohort that this was cruel. The subject did not deserve to be teased in such a way. The subject here, of course, being the gardens and the gardeners who work within them. And it feels kind of unfair to the grass that did so well all summer across the parks and gardens of England, that survived almost to the very end. Autumn was in sight. It was getting coated with dew in the mornings. It could see October, almost touch it, feel the rains, and then suddenly, no, crisped, baked, bleached out. It's like one of those cops in a cheaply made movie who had just one day left until retirement, and then took the bullet for the hero. And that's how I feel about the poor grass. I went past Clapham Common on the bus the other day, and it was sort of Serengeti lioness beige colour, which was sad to see, but never mind, it will be back. I think we're forecast for pounding rain and gusts from all directions in the next couple of days, so I can feel happier as I snuggle down inside my anorak. The week started dealing with the casualties of some of the crisping weather. I moved around a lot of the Candelabra primula. These are plants that survive in dryish, normal border conditions, but never really thrive. What they tend to do is sulk until you get a damp couple of weeks, and then they throw out these wonderfully large, long, lettucey leaves, and then it dries up and they give up on half that leaf matter, and that dies back and crisps up, and then you get a little patch of green, which is the size of leaf they should have put out originally had they not been so greedy. And I had some of these in a bed where they had been doing this all summer, on and off. So I pulled them out and plopped them into one of the dampest parts of the garden, which is not damp due to soil conditions or particularly to its aspect, but damp because it's next to one of our prime watering stations. So anytime anything needs to be washed or scrubbed or given a little revivifying drink, then the splash off meanders down into this bed. And it also is one of the places where the irrigation systems take their lead from. And there's always a little leak somewhere or other. So it remains a permanent, oozy sort of place while still being in the sunshine. And here the candelabra primula will thrive. They will think themselves on the edge of some boggy lake, and they will send up their wonderful multicoloured tiers of flowers in the spring. So that was nice. That was a good job, which felt like I was doing a Beth Chatto and rescuing a plant from the wrong place, like a careers advisor who has told that unruly child that in the army you're paid to kill people, and feels that he has set someone on their true calling. Now this plant is free to flourish. I then moved on to putting out some winter bedding. I planted pansies, exclusively pansies. I've done violas a lot in the past, but this year I decided that I wanted bigger and blousier, and I planted 3,599 of them, because one of them broke off in my hands as I tried to get it out of its little container. I'm using a lot of blue pansies this year, planting them among grasses and hacknacloa and the remaining alyssum to make this quite exciting, quite ruffled old ladyish effect. And hopefully that will remain as the other plants fade in, fade out. This is how I tend to use bedding in this garden. I think that the pansies and the primulas and the other winter plants are done a disservice by being called winter bedding, because really they're very good now, and they're going to be very, very good in the spring again. And what they will do in the winter is just survive and throw out some flowers in some of the warmer periods. And calling them winter bedding makes people think, oh, well, I'm getting cold. My nose is dripping. It must be time to plant my winter bedding. And that's not true. Winter bedding should be planted now. You want your winter bedding to go in actually earlier. I try to go for the last week of August. And then the plant has a couple of months in that lovely warm soil. That soil that is still clinging to its heat. And there in the soil they will send out the roots that are going to keep them going, keep them happy, and mean that they can burst into life again whenever the weather allows them. So if you haven't done it yet, go out, get your winter bedding, get it now. Start shoving it into the places where it's going to flower, and you will be rewarded with a better display. In some places, I replaced last year's winter bedding with this year's winter bedding. I've let pansies and violas grow wild through other plants. You couldn't do this in a carpet bedding scheme because they start to get almost vine-like in their length until their flowering extremes are miles away from where they were originally set down. But if you are growing them in a mixed border where other things are growing up and around them, and there are structures for them to grow in between and around and through and play a little duet with, then they can stay all year long and only just start to look ropey now. So that was a good job. It was a hard, tiring physical job. I got that wonderful circular blister in the centre of the palm that comes from downward pressure on a trowel handle, which made it feel like late November, when I normally get that blister doing the big tulip plant out. So a little bit of time travel, a wonderful display of bedding. Lots of red pansies I've gone for this year as well. I'm really feeling red at the moment. I don't know why different years seize me. I suppose it's fashion. I must be picking up something subconsciously in the air, whether it's the music or the clothes. I've subconsciously seen a lot of red trousers recently. I don't know, I'm feeling red in the garden. I've got lots of red wallflowers coming through, lots of red pansies. Reds and greens are going to be the motif of spring for me. I think I've got about 10,000 burnt red tulips coming as well. 2 years ago I was very, very into orange. And then now I think I've had this buffer zone in between. And this time it's red and blues. Though I've gone off purple completely. I don't know if you other fashionistas feel the same, Maybe you do. Maybe we've all picked up on these subconscious cues. Anyway, that was my bedding. On Tuesday, I wasn't in the garden. I went down to the landscape show in Battersea Park and enthused for 45 minutes about the joy of historic gardens, and sent out a call for more people to go into the archives and discover quirky little things about gardens. It was a very enjoyable talk, and the audience were lovely and very engaged, and lots of them came up and said hello afterwards. So if you're a new listener who saw me at the landscape show, then welcome to the Garden Log podcast. This is how we do things. We talk about my week, which you were a part of last week. Thank you very much. On Wednesday, I was planting up this vast stone planter. It's a huge, great thing from the ruins of a town in Italy. It must have been the reservoir for quite a substantial house, and now it is the home of an olive tree. I thought an olive tree for a little Italian nod, and also to give it a bit of height, a bit of upwardness. And around the base of this olive tree are 3 Astilia silver spear, that fantastic spiky silver plant that seems to shine out. And then all around the edge of the planter is a cascade of variegated silvery ivy. It tumbles down and blurs the boundaries. And then in the middle are these huge pools of true blue pansies, because once you're messing around with this amount of silver foliage, then really you have to go blue as your popping colour of choice. The whole thing looks calm and tranquil and classy, despite being made of strangely architectural plants, and that's the effect of the silver and the blue. I'm very pleased with it. I think it looks nice, and it has been stopping people. People have been coming up and saying, "By Jove, that looks good," which is nice. I'll try and get a picture of that at some point so you can see the majesty of this, particularly the pot itself. It is something to behold. On Thursday, I was away again in the Natural History Museum archives, which is a beautiful and brilliant place. Forgive me if I talked about this last week, but it is amazing. You get to go into this room in the reptile gallery and ring a little doorbell on the side in between a stuffed monitor lizard and a load of skinks. And then this archivist comes and takes you off, and then you go into these stacks and reams and piles of paper. And I found the most incredible things. I found a letter from Alfred Russel Wallace talking about gardens at Waterloo Park and saying how much he despised Victorian gardening, and that he would let the whole thing get covered in brambles and wildflowers and have every child in London come through and pick a posy for their mum, which was very nice. And then I found this incredible file. It's all done alphabetically by year, a lot of the museum's old correspondence. So I was looking for, letters in 1906, and I was looking for the London County Council. And so obviously I'd come across things like London County Council, and the next section would be Captain Loddon. And I was tempted into Captain Loddon's letters every time. And Captain Loddon was being a rogue, and he was writing letters back to the museum saying, "Sir, do not impugn me. I swear those penguins must have been dead well before my men arrived, for we saw hide nor hair of them." And you think, not true, Captain Loddon. We know you ate those penguins. We know it for a fact. But I had to go away from those and go back into garden history, which I did with some success, and spent a pleasant Thursday. And then Friday came around, the last day of gardening for the week, and I did bits and pieces, as is my wont on a Friday. I moved quite a few epimediums around. Epimediums are one of those plants that you seem to be able to move whenever you like. I don't think anyone's ever written a guide saying, move epimediums in the spring, just after the flowers come up, or move them just before the growth points go dormant, because really you just do what you like to epimediums. You dig them up and split them out. For anyone who doesn't know, epimedium is a brilliant ground cover for dry shade. There are lots of quite exotic, rare Japanese forms, but the ones we have over here tend to be the European forms. The epimedium cross versicolor, which is a fantastic ground cover for dry shade, with these wiry stems and these little leaves shaped like the shields of a Bayeux tapestry Norman. And they come up, and over here they tend to be almost evergreen. They don't really die away. It's just that by the end of the winter they are looking slightly haggard. They are looking like any vegetable that has been left out to frost and freeze for months on end. They've started to dry and crisp and are in need of some lip balm, so they tend to get chopped down in the spring. And then you get to see these little flowers come up for a couple of weeks. These weird-looking alien buds come up amongst the old cut-off stalks, and then they are chased upwards, those flowers, by a new flush of leaves, which come out in these beautiful shades of red and veinings of green. Anyway, they're a really, really useful plant for shade, and they grow into big clumps very quickly, so you can chop them up and move them around. And I was chopping up some old clumps and moving them to bits of the garden where they were just in sight of their old home clump, so they could play with each other and play with the epimedium audience, who would see a certain continuity in the shady areas of the garden by having these clumps all around the place. It's very nice to get to the stage in a garden where the plants that I put in on my arrival here 3 years ago are now big enough to start splitting, to start putting them into other parts, to start bulking out our stock. Plant expenditure I see going down fairly dramatically, particularly on the herbaceous stuff, because I've got a stock of plants I like. I'll still experiment, I'll still throw things around and go out and buy ridiculous choices and do strange themed beds. But in terms of backbone plants, in terms of doers, there are enough stock within the garden now of things like the epimedium, of the grasses, of the hagnacloas, to start being generous with them, throwing them around the place. In a couple more years, once I've been in place for 5 years or so, then you get to another stage. You get to the, oh my gosh, there's far too many of these things. Shall we just leave them by the side of the road, send them off down the river in a Moses basket? Can we not get rid of these epimediums? But at the moment, we're just in that nice stage where they're starting to look after themselves and spread themselves around the acreage. It's a happy time. And that was really it. Once I was there with the epimediums in the woodland, there were little other bits of woodland fiddling arounds to do. We planted out quite a lot of lunaria. The lunaria, the honesty plant, that plant that comes up with the purple brassica flowers and then dries into those wonderful moon trees with the little papery circles of seeds all over them. And we sowed those earlier in the summer. They will now stay as sort of fluffy-leaved little rosettes. Now they've survived their attack by the cabbage whites, got to them just in time, and then next year they should flower nicely and then remain in the woodland as sort of ghostly sentinels above the expanding green ground cover carpet of evergreen ferns and azarum and things below them. I think it's going to be quite effective. I hope they get enough light to do a good flowering job before the canopy closes back over them again in the spring. No doubt you will hear about it here in some future episode of the Garden Log. But until then, that's enough from this week. Let's see if I have any recommendations for you. A few recommendations for you this week, all book related. I'm afraid, though if you don't go in for books, then just pretend I told you to go and visit as many gardens as you can and see the changing colours of the season. But for those of you who do enjoy books, I read a very good thriller. And I don't normally talk about the fiction stuff that I read, but a very good thriller by Geoffrey Household called Rogue Male. It's very, very famous, very well known, but it's a chase thriller, a one man against sinister agents kind of job, written in 1939. And it is quite evocative of the British landscape. It's sort of a chase thriller crossed with a novel about a sporting gentleman's hunt for a badger, something like that. Lots of descriptions of quaint yokels and a vanished England. And I quite like it because it has this slightly obscure first-person style where you never really know who the narrator is, and you suspect you don't really like him, but he's certainly an interesting character. You don't quite know what he's up to. It reminded me a lot of one of my very favourite novels, which is Ice by Anna Kavan, which is another first-person narrator, gentleman on the run, though he's on the run from vast crashing balls of ice, and you get the impression that he's just a deeply, deeply damaged and unpleasant person, which I think Geoffrey's hero might be as well, but it's less disturbing in that way, more of just a page-turning fun read. You'll read it in a few hours if you find a copy, so that's a nice one to go for. I've also been reading a very strange book, but one that I've enjoyed immensely, which is called Hollow Places, An Unusual History of Land and Legend. That's by Christopher Hadley, and it centres on an ancient parish which has this ancient church with an even more ancient, surprisingly, tomb depicting Piers Shonks, who was a local dragon slayer, or so the legend goes, and it explores the landscape of the parish, the people, the history. There's a lot of rooting around in archives. Christopher Hadley lets his research seep out onto the page, so you get his trips to the archives when he discovers a fusty, mouldy old box. And you also get lots of stories about trees and field boundaries and ordnance survey maps and manor houses long burned down and rumours of why they burned down and who burned them down and which demonic presence might have inspired them to do so. So it's fun. It's all of my interests kind of clinging together in one lumpy clog. And thirdly, I've been reading A Farmer's Year by, believe it or not, H. Rider Haggard. He of She and King Solomon's Mines fame. He also wrote one of those quintessential countryman's diaries, observing the weather and what he saw in the fields and his crops, and giving the history of his farm. And it's very, very, very honest. It's brutally honest, heartbreakingly honest about how hard it is to be a farmer in the late Victorian period. He's writing in the 1890s, which is the time when the Americans are flooding Europe with vast swathes of grain, and all of the poor English farmers don't quite know what to do, and all of their labourers are moving to the city to get a job in a factory building fireworks and motor cars. And it's the same period, actually. I really wish I'd read this when I read Aikenfield by Ronald Blythe, because it's the period that sets off that whole century of rural poverty, rural abandonment, the empty places in the east of England. It's the movements that led to all of his farmers being from Middlesbrough, farming in Suffolk. Actually, H. Rider Haggard is also a boy from East Anglia. So it's a really good book. It's well worth reading. I'm only a couple of months into it, so I'll give a further review. If you fancy looking into any of those, that is Rogue Male by Geoffrey Household, A Farmer's Year by H. Rider Haggard, and Hollow Places, An Unusual History of Land and Legend by Christopher Hadley. And also, obviously, you can look into Ice by Anna Kavan and Aikenfield by Ronald Blythe, because they are two books that are worth reading at any time of year, life or day. We're getting towards the contemplative season, the time for log fires, for long afternoons in the armchair. So it really is time to start compiling your reading list, getting together your companions for those dark and lonely nights. We're not there yet. I suppose we still should be raging, shouldn't we? We should be raging a little bit longer. But I'm willing to capitulate. I will go gentle. I'm going to go gentle with a good book and a glass of wine, I think. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to this week's episode. I will be back with more tales from the garden soon. If you would like to get in touch with me for any reason, I can be found at thegardenlogpodcast@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at Ben's Garden, on Instagram at GardenerDark, and I think that's about it. You can leave me a review as well. Some people do, and they do wonders for my esteem. I don't know if they do anything for the discoverability matrix, which is what we're supposed to be enthralled to, but I certainly enjoy reading them. So if you fancy doing that, do that as well. If not, no matter. I hope you have a wonderful week, whether you are gardening or not. Thank you very much, and goodbye.